So the two hardest cases that I've worked with were both in my family. It's my father and my grandfather. And first it was my father, because Grandpa had a lot of hesitation to allow me to work with him. You know, he's a veteran of two wars, not world wars, but two Purple Hearts, and just a very religious, very fundamental Christianity. And so there's a threat of like, what am I bringing to him? Am I going to threaten his beliefs? I'm a vegetarian now. I'm the first vegetarian he's ever met, and so that's tremendous for him. And so my gateway to my grandfather was through my father, because my father crushed his neck when he was 17, made a faulty tackle in football, and 4 vertebrae on the side were flattened and impinged on his spine. And 23 years later, he still got into West Point, became an Army Ranger, became an Army officer. At the end of when he was retiring from the Army, they had the technology, so they did the operation. They took some bone from his hip, they shaved off the transverse processes, put a couple bars and some pins in his neck, and he felt great. And then coming home from a hunting trip, guy hit him from behind in his car, gave him whiplash, broke his neck again. And so he had to have it fixed again. So now he's got more bars and more pins in his neck. And he's not handicapped, but he's got 100% veterans disability, gets the handicap sticker. And he also, at some point, a few years earlier, unrelated, fell off a ladder onto some cement and broke his back. And so he has a fusion in his back, too. So he has 3 spinal fusions and 3 more discs, which are ruptured, which is much worse than just bulging. It's bigger than a bulge, ruptured. And so they implanted an electrode to his spine and some of those nerves that just sends a continuous stream of electricity to reduce the pain. Basically just masking the pain. It's not reducing it, it's just giving him a tremendous other sensation that can distract him from the pain, right? And so he dreads going to sleep. He goes to sleep at 9 a.m. every day because waking up is misery, because you're so stiff and his jaw is clenching from the pain, and he has to have something to help him breathe because he'll cut off his own air because he's clenching so much. And by all other means, I mean, yeah, his right leg doesn't sweat very much. But he still does yard work. He just puts on his back brace and he can do yard work. And he works. He has got his big tractor. He likes moving things around and whatnot. So after a couple years of doing these isolations and seeing them work for me and other people, I was suggesting it to him. But he's, of course, resistant. For 30 years, he's dreaded getting up out of bed, and he had developed a little routine for himself. If I roll over this way and I put my hands like this, and I lean on the side of the bed, and I breathe this way, like he could give himself some relief. His little 2-hour routine. He developed a 2-hour yoga therapy routine for himself, but it was all reinventing the wheel. Because as soon as I observe it, I'm like, your breathing is garbage. It can be better. And of course, that's not a good way to correct somebody. But I saw a lot of aggression in his practice that was giving temporary relief. You know how they say, like, don't pop knuckles? Like, he was popping things to get that relief, but it's displacing them more and more over time. And so it's causing future suffering. And so basically, what it was when I let go of the need to influence him. And I just started talking as if it wasn't father-son, as if it was just somebody. Like, if anybody ever meets me, like if I go out to a pub or a concert or something, I'm talking about yoga. I don't talk about beer. Maybe I have a beer, but I talk about anatomy and how the beer is affecting your circulatory system and like breathe with your diaphragm. Like, these are the things I talk about. So we were sitting around the counter and I'm just talking about sacroiliac pain, and not knowing what it was there was a little influence, because I see him walk into the kitchen and how he's walking, and I'm like, I've walked like that before because I've injured myself. I put my leg behind my head too much and displaced your SI joint. And so I see how he's walking, and that just stimulates my conversation. So I start to talk about sacroiliac pain, and I was in India, and the guy did this thing, and I learned how to use a block, and it relieved my pain. And I can notice that you're walking a certain way, and while I'm talking, I don't let him have a breath. Otherwise, I grab a block, and I put it between his legs, and I say, internally rotate, and I'll lean against the counter, stand up tall, pop. And he's like, whoa, I feel really good right now. Like, it's like going to the chiropractor, but you don't need external service. You learn how to do it yourself. By contracting certain muscles and releasing others, you can pop any joint on your own. And now ego can be imposed there, so you could just be popping it in the wrong direction more and more and more. So you got to come back to I would say egoless, but you got to come to a practice where you can let go of your identity just a little bit. And that often requires aloneness, quiet, solitude. Practicing Hatha yoga is meant to be practiced alone, and every now and then you meet a teacher, and the teacher helps you refine things. That's tough to do. Most people don't practice like that. And so he became convinced, and he was like, can we do a session? So we did a session, and then we have this electric meter. I have the testimonial on my YouTube. So you can literally measure the day after he went from 3.8 to a 2.8 on his setting. He's like, I've never lived at 2.8 for more than 12 hours, or more than 1 hour. And I went 12 hours before I even noticed that it was at 2.8. And I was like, that's tremendous. Let's take a testimonial. So fast forward, Grandma hears on the phone from Dad how tremendous the yoga therapy is, how beneficial it is. So Grandma buys a lesson from me. Basically, I don't do a lot with Grandma, but we talk. We talk a lot of kind of vocabulary in a language that she's not accustomed to. She doesn't get that conversation in the house that she's living in. And so when I start to talk about the mind, how syntax and certain vocabulary affects the nervous system differently, and then a couple of things, like she had carpal tunnel, so I gave her a little wrist massage or something. It was beneficial for her, but that was the added gateway to my grandfather. When Grandma and son were approving of what I was doing, Grandpa became a little bit more receptive. But even then, it was just little doses, like drop your tongue. Like I got him one of those Theracane things, so he can kind of, I don't know how much he uses it, but he does when I'm there. I show him do this, and then he does this. You know the Theracane, like it's a little hook arm that you can use to kind of get in between your ribs and get under your hip and massage yourself. And more like almost like a deep tissue or like a pressure point therapy, because it's very pointed. You take the hook and you dig it there. And so fast forwarding, I get a call, or somehow I'm on the phone with my mom, and it turns out 3 or 4 weeks earlier, Grandpa was taken to the hospital because he had a resting heart rate of 200, which is tremendous. You might as well just be dead at 200. Your heart explodes. I don't think I could survive 200. That's tremendous. And of course, Grandpa, he survived cancer a couple times. They removed it, and he's got, what are these, like heart stents? Is that what they call it? Or, so had heart surgery, and, and he takes medicine to thin his blood because, and he can't eat anything with vitamin K, which is basically like leafy green stuff, because it'll thicken the blood and then it won't pass through. And of course, talking with Grandpa about diet and like what, else might be contributing to thick blood, that's not so much an option at this point. It was very difficult for my dad to change his routine after 30 years of doing it a certain way. And when I wasn't there anymore to insist on do it this way, it reversed back to the way it was. And the pain returned. And now we've just done our third round. So I came back, fixed it again. It eventually devolved back into what it was. I come back this third time, and now I have an emotional button because Grandpa is sitting in a chair all day. He wakes up, he reads his Bible, he does, he takes his morning pills, and then, hangs out with Grandma a little bit, and then just kind of sits and watches the news while maybe he reads all day. And eventually he goes to bed, reads the Bible again, and whatever. But he's sedentary, and you can see his hip flexors are shortening. And standing is now less comfortable than sitting in that chair. And that's the emotional button for my dad. Because my dad is aging faster than my grandpa because of the spinal injuries. So in his mid-60s, my grandpa was still working on the farm, the cow farm. And he's a strong man. Now he's like in his late 80s. But at 65, my dad can't do that. And so he's aging faster. And he looks at his dad, my grandpa, and he's like, I don't want to be like that when I'm 80, when I'm 85. If I live that long, I don't want to be chair-ridden, which it's already happening, So that's the button. So when he doesn't want to do his yoga therapy, so you want to turn out like Grandpa, Dad? And so I get a call about Grandpa. Grandpa had 200 heart rate. And so I call Grandpa and I say, sit down. You're going to do this right now. Breathe with your diaphragm. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Hold it. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Hold it. how's your heart rate feel now? Wow, it's super calm, Chris. Yeah, do this daily. And he does. And so he's keeping it under control. That's just a little bypassing, just like dropping the tongue. It's just a little bypass. Just breathe with your diaphragm, and you can offset a lot of things. Why am I saying all of this? Who has heard of Krishnamurti? Anybody? Nobody? He's dead. He was a world-renowned philosopher, Indian guy, but he wasn't Hindu because he was raised by this British society of something or other. And so I don't even know that he was Christian. I just think he was not Hindu, but he was Indian. And world-renowned, he was a big inspiration for Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee studied Krishnamurti a lot, especially after Bruce Lee broke his back and couldn't really compete like he was. And Krishnamurti was really big on absolute independence. Do not rely on other people for your health, your well-being, your income, make it happen yourself kind of thing. And Bruce Lee was really attracted to that. And Krishnamurti had learned a little bit of yoga from a guy named BKS Iyengar. Most of these guys that I'm going to name are probably dead. BKS is dead. He was the guy that's really known for using chairs and lots of props. He was known as chair yoga. It's called Iyengar yoga. He'd learned a couple of poses from Iyengar, but hadn't met his teacher in a long time. And so he comes to a guy named Krishnamacharya, who was the teacher of BKS Iyengar. But they're both old guys. They're both in their 80s at this time. It's really hard for an old guy who's world-renowned as a philosopher to drop ego and become a student to another old guy who's also world-renowned and a philosopher. That's a tough thing to do, tough pill to swallow. So Krishnamacharya, in his wisdom, said, I won't teach you, my son will teach you. So now you have this world-renowned philosopher, Krishnamurti, who's coming and taking yoga from Desikachar, who's about 30 years old and has only been teaching yoga for a few months at the time. And this whole story is being told by Desikachar, by the way, who's the son. And he said, I went to my father afterwards and I was like, I don't know what to teach this guy. I've been teaching for a couple months. And he's like, don't worry, I'll tell you what to teach him. Just, he won't listen to me. I already know that. And so Krishnamurti would come to Desikachar, and Desikachar said that he was the very best student of anybody I've ever taught. And now Desikachar is in his 80s. He's like, if anybody I've ever taught, Krishnamurti was the best because he dropped everything. He came, I said, show me what you know. He showed me what he knowed. It was terrible. Tears were welling in his eyes because he was pushing too hard to try to do these poses. And so I said, we're throwing it all out. We're starting over. And he dropped everything. He dropped his routine, and he listened. And there was no need of reciprocation because Krishnamurti was world famous. And so it wasn't expected that Desikachar would come to his lectures, that would come and listen to him teach the world. He came once, but then didn't want to go again, and Krishnamurti had no problem with that. The ability to drop the pattern, even if only temporarily, and try something new is paramount. It's paramount. It's not just about accumulating knowledge. Some knowledge has to just be replaced. You can't just keep collecting knowledge because a lot of knowledge is contradictory with other knowledge. And so then you end up having this internal, I should but I can't. I should but I can't. And that's insanity. That's craziness. I should but I can't. It's this forward movement, backward movement. It's this expansion, contraction. You just want to expand. And so some knowledge just needs to be replaced. You don't just keep stacking it, you just move it aside and replace it. And that's for you to decide for yourself. It's very difficult to be objective about your yoga practice in a group setting, because part of ego is social identity and how other people see you. And so it's easier to replace beliefs and replace patterns, in solitude. In solitude, we're more comfortable disconnecting a little bit, getting more in tune with that constant thing that is me, and then going back into the world and reconnecting with what I want to reconnect with. That's kind of how it happens. The difference between a workshop and a class. Because we're here basically to give as much individualized attention as we can, and very specific knowledge that you can't get elsewhere. You can't find what I'm teaching you anywhere unless you do what I've done. I have a teacher in Oklahoma that has massively severe scoliosis that taught me these muscle isolations. Go and find him. He's not on social media very much. He doesn't teach it like I do. I have 415 videos on YouTube because part of my path is communicating this stuff. So even if you found him and he taught it to you, he's not going to communicate it to you in the same way that I can, because I focus on words. You could go to India and find BNS Iyengar, different than BKS. BNS Iyengar, and he'll teach you Nabho Mudra, and he'll teach you pranayama. But it's not going to come with much explanation. It's just sit down, do it. And I needed to develop the empathy to be able to transmit mudra and pranayama in a soft and sensitive way that Westerners will receive. Because Westerners don't submit very easy, right? So, but in India, you submit. You go to the teacher and you don't talk. You just listen and you do. And you do to your best of your ability. And you just do again. And even if it hurts, you just do it again. You don't complain. And then obviously the language. I have teachers that I learn language from, but they don't know Hatha Yoga. So you can learn how to talk, you can learn syntax and tonality and the meaning of the facial expressions that you're holding, even right now, are cluing me into the pictures and sentences that you're saying to yourself while I'm talking. That I'm talking, but you're seeing other things in your mind while I'm talking, and those are just commercials. That's a movie reel. That's not here. It's an illusion. And they can teach you all about that, but then how do you use Hatha Yoga to process that? How do you use Hatha Yoga to let go of the hooks that those pictures have on you? Those are like the silent strings that are tugging at you. And just like Krishnamurti, I want independence from those external influences. Because I know one day, I'm going to die. I know this. It's gloomy, but I know that one day I'm going to exhale and it's going to be my last breath. But I also know that the computer isn't going to shut off immediately just because I breathe my last exhale. The computer will continue for a little bit. And in those moments, minutes, hours, however long it takes, even longer if you read like the Tibetan Book of the Dead and what happens, but eventually something happens, a transition happens into something. In that window is when I'm most vulnerable. That's when I'll know if I practiced well. That's when I'll know, that moment from my last exhale, and even leading up to that, but from that last exhale to the transition, there's going to be a lot of unseen strings tugging at my mind. Oh, I should have done that. Oh, I was mean to that person. Oh, I wish I had done that with my life. Blah, 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 blah. And for me, yoga is processing all of those unmet wants and desires or longings or remorse or regrets or anything, any negative contraction, any contraction emotion associated with my thoughts, and how do I describe it to myself so that it's an expansion? It's kind of like, I flipped my handlebars and I landed on my head and I injured my neck. And so then it was really hard to teach yoga the next day. Wow, so I became really, really good at describing yoga without having to walk around and touch people or demonstrating it. I can just describe it. That was the turning point. What a blessing. I needed that because there are no world-famous yogis who need to have hands-on. They are all very good at explaining it in a way that you basically get 99% of it just with my words, and the hand is just like a little icing. So that was a blessing. All experiences can be framed that way. It's just some are a little more challenging than others, especially when you have this emotional investment in it. So you practice yoga to disconnect the emotion from it, detach a little bit, become a little more free from the strings, and then it'll seem absurd when you go back into your body, back into the world, into mundane living as they call it, and the strings will be like, no, it doesn't pull my string anymore. Have you ever had a friend or an enemy or somebody that they knew how to push your buttons, and then you went away for a while, you did some self-help or you worked on yourself or you just grew just normally like a human does. You came back and all of a sudden that button, it just didn't seem to push, a big one for me would be moving away from home. And now I go back and visit my family, and after so much work on myself, my mom and dad, I don't think they intentionally try to push buttons, but naturally, as the saying goes, your family knows all of your buttons because they put most of them there. But naturally, as you grow out of that, you go back to family and they're just not pushing your buttons the same way. Has nobody experienced this? Am I the only one?
I have a daughter.
Yeah. And so you can...
My buttons still get pushed, unfortunately.
Yeah, some do and maybe some don't, And so all of them can be changed into a don't. And it's not about being impersonal or sociopathic and having no empathy for other people. It's about valuing your own peace senior to others, because you ultimately are transmitting exactly how you're feeling. And if you don't have that peace, the obsession with another person's peace, it becomes like a downward spiral of, I'm not at peace, so I'm going to try to make you at peace. But they're not at peace, and they're going to try to make me at peace. And then so we just keep making each other less peaceful. You cultivate that inner peace, and then you share it. And it naturally gets shared just by interacting with the world. You cultivate the inner peace, and then you live. And in your living, your peace will radiate. It will infect people. And that's a good virus. It's the peace virus. So we're going to do a little yoga. Hope you guys found that helpful. Namaste.